voice spoke to her, though she heard nothing of the words above her own harsh breathing. She clung gratefully to a strong neck. There was warmth here and kindness, and she needed both. She began to cry, silently at first, and then unashamedly. Her eyes closed as she remained clasped in a warm, strong embrace. When she was spent, she fell into a silent lethargy, content to be held close and warm without questioning. At last she was set down, and the boat moved rhythmically towards the bank. She remained quiescent, not considering her fate, but leaving everything to the oarsman who had rescued her from the river and thus made himself responsible for her. When the boat gently bumped the broad wooden steps of the bank, she felt herself lifted and laid her head down on the broad shoulder once more with a sigh of weariness. A small hut stood solid against the pale dawn sky, and from within came the cheerful glow of a fire. The warmth of the hut surrounded her, and she allowed herself to be set in a chair without demur, for here, she sensed, was sanctuary. The dark figure flickered into life as the light from the oil lamp illuminated the hut. She sighed softly, her eyes meeting his, and they stared at each other for a long moment in silence. She unable to speak of her gratitude to the big man who had taken her from the river. Siona Llewelyn remained silent, passive, as though waiting for some sign from the large-eyed girl seated before him. He was a big, handsome man of middle years. His dark, springy hair held traces of silver, but the eyes set deep in the weather-beaten face were green like a stormy sea and gleamed with a love of life. Too much of life, some said, for his wife Emily was big with child again, and she a woman past her 40th year. And, he told himself, he was a man who had no right to be feeling strange stirrings within him, a half-understood longing for his lost youth. Siona's life was the river. She brought in his daily bread, and he loved her as though she was a secret mistress. She and his wife Emily had been all he'd ever needed. He had inherited the halfpenny ferry boat which had been passed down through 4 generations, carrying passengers across the River Swan in all but the worst of weathers, and by siring 7 sons had ensured that the boat would remain in Llewelyn hands for many years to come.
"Going into the river is not the answer, Mechi,"
Siona said, startling Nerys as she watched him stir up the fire before adding fresh logs.
"Running away never solved anything."
She didn't answer. She could not, for there was no excuse she could make. It seemed to her now that there was nothing so bad that it was worth the taking of her own life. He looked into the fire, and she watched the strong line of his shoulders with a feeling of reassurance. He was a good man, this one who had saved her life. She could talk to him. "This was to have been my wedding day," she said softly, and thought of the fine silk frock which had hung behind the door in her lodgings, waiting to be slipped over her head and to make her into a beautiful bride. But I was a fool ever to believe in sweet promises and softly spoken words of love. Siona seemed to look right into her, his green eyes glowing redly in the light from the fire. He seemed so wise, so strong, that she felt suddenly foolish.
"So you were let down, Mechi, and your pride hurt. That doesn't mean that a fine-looking young woman like you should give up on life."
He paused and shook his head at her.
"This man, whoever he was, can't be worth a light. For anyone who would turn his back on a lovely girl like you must be a half-wit."
Nerys sank back in her chair, her breath suddenly short, the pain within her growing and spreading as she saw behind closed lids the tall, thin frame of Terence Marsh, a sophisticated man who had played in almost every theatre in the land. He had stood before her, his handsome face alight, and begged her to be his wife. Had he been acting even then?